to Octocon Presents with Glasgow Worldcon as well, of all good things in moderation. A lot of conventions say that they have a need for moderators, and sometimes there's a panel that you think that you would rather moderate than be on, but you've never moderated before. What do you do? Our panel of moderators are going to talk about their particular methods, the steps that they take to make sure that they have enough questions, what to do if things seem to go off the rails, and advice that they wish they had been given when they first started moderating, just in time for Glasgow Worldcon. I'm Kat. I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves, but before I do, I am just going to mention that I am participating as both a moderator and a panelist since there is only 3 of us. So Catherine, if you wouldn't mind starting.
Okay. Hi, I'm Catherine Sharp. I'm a long-term committee member and program runner for Octocon, and I am currently working very, very hard on the program for Glasgow 2024, this year's Worldcon, which I am extremely excited about. It is all too close. There is still way too much to do, but yes, it's going to be great.
And I'm Paul Carroll. I am co-chair of Octocon with Kat, and I'll be attending Glasgow Worldcon. It's only my second time going to a Worldcon, and my first time was when I first moderated a panel. So it's been a trial. It was a trial by fire. So that's my starting point in how we're going to start picking things apart.
And I'm Kat. I am the co-chair of Octocon with Paul, as well as the head of program this year, and accessibility officer, which I pretty much always plug because I enjoy talking about accessibility. Like I said, I'm going to be participating as both a panelist and a moderator, which kind of brings me to my first question, I guess, which is there anything in particular that you do to manage expectations for the audience when you get started? And either of you can feel free to jump in, or I will pick a name. Yes, Catherine.
So it actually goes beyond just managing expectations for the audience. It's also managing expectations for your panelists. And we'll get a bit more later into how to talk to your panelists before the panel and so on. But the fact is that everyone's got a slightly different moderating style. And if you're a first-time moderator, you're not going to know what that is, and that's absolutely fine. But it's still good to have a little bit of a think about it. So like Kat said, they're moderating and they're speaking on this panel because there's only 3 of us. If there's 4 people and you're the moderator as well, then you're probably not going to want to do so much talking because there's a lot of other people to talk. So it's learning how to balance that kind of thing out. But it all depends on your personal style. Again, there are moderators who will completely join in the conversation too. And again, that's something you really need to let your panelists know. So they can come in prepared and they're not suddenly blindsided by either you not saying as much as they thought you might, or you saying way more than they thought you might. And the same goes for the audience. It's quite useful if you are the type of moderator who is going to talk a bit as well. It's good to let the audience know that in advance. The most common style is that the moderator is there to ask the questions and facilitate the conversation between the other people on the panel, rather than being there to actually contribute significantly to the panel themselves. So if you are going to do that for whatever reason, it could be you're the particular expert in the subject as well as there's not enough people, then it's good to let the audience know ahead so they know what to expect. Because yeah, we do get people complaining about people's moderation styles because it's not what they expect. And it's not that there's something wrong with it, it's just not what they've grown to expect. So yeah, that's quite a lot to say on the subject, apparently.
I know that how I found my moderating style is I took a look about what my, wow, that sounded was convoluted. I took a look at what my strengths are. So I have a background in theater and performing. I used to do stand-up comedy. I used to do improv theater, a whole lot of things. And what I am good at is sounding conversational and leading a conversation. And so that's where I was like, this is the type of moderator that I am going to be good at being. So why try to be good? Why try to do something that I'm not good at? Let's focus on the part that I am good at. And I think that that's part of why I tend to be half panelist, half moderator intentionally, to clarify. When I am a half panelist, half moderator, we go into it knowing that that's going to be the situation. Paul, do you have anything in particular that you'd like to add?
In terms of preparing the audience, I guess the helpful thing is to remind them what the panel is supposed to be about. uh, reading the description as provided by the program team for a convention is usually a good start, because it sets the tone and it lets people know that things are actually beginning as well. Because sometimes people might think, oh, they're just having a conversation, but they could have actually started the panel and people just weren't paying attention to the beginning of it.
Yeah, we definitely want to make sure that we are clear that the panel is starting. I know that, and this is going to be part of talking to your panelists beforehand, and this is part of why I brought up me being accessibility officer. I have a few disabilities, chronic conditions, as well as various neurodivergences that we don't really need to get into, but anxiety being the big one that is going to affect me on a panel. And usually I know how to manage myself, I know what I need, and I know how to pace myself accordingly. Last year at Octocon was very different for a lot of reasons that I'm not actually going to get into because it would be really long. But it did mean that before each panel, I had to talk to my panelists and I had to talk to my moderators, if I wasn't the one moderating, to let them know that, by the way, one of the things that's been happening is I get about 15 seconds warning that I need to get flat on the ground right now. And if I don't obey, it's happening anyway. But if I do obey, it's better. So if that happens, I am going to get flat on the ground. It's okay. It's not an emergency. Please just pass the microphone down to me and let's keep going. And luckily, we didn't have to do that. It didn't actually happen during a panel. But being able to talk to my panelists and have them trust me on what it was that I needed was a big help. And I don't really know if I would have felt comfortable doing that at other conventions. I definitely felt comfortable with it at Octocon because of the culture that we have cultivated, for lack of a better word. But that goes back into establishing things with your panelists. And if it I did think about, do I need to warn the audience about something that might happen? No, let's wait and see if it actually comes up. And it turned out to not come up.
It's good people were prepared. Actually,
yes.
I just want to go back to preparing the audience as well. And I'm going to refer back to a particular panel I did at Octocon probably a few times because of the subject matter and our very good set of panelists who are on it. And it was a panel that was about sentient spaceships, which obviously these days touches on AI. In the old-fashioned science fiction use of AI to mean actual artificial intelligence rather than algorithms, and we're not going to get me started on that. But that was actually one of the but that was actually one of the things I mentioned up front of at the very start of the panel, to just establish, as well as giving the description. I established that this is a panel about fiction. This is a panel about fictional artificial intelligence and sentience. It is not a panel about what we currently call AI. And there was somebody at the end who stood up and said, well, what about AI? And I was actually said to them, look, this is not a panel for that question. So, there was only one, luckily, but we had established up front. And again, this was something I'd pre-established with the panelists, that this was the scope. So if you know your panel is going to be a particular topic, and another good example is if you know it's touching on things that are going to trigger people. If you feel it needs content warnings for mature themes of any kind and so on, that is a really good thing to establish up front with your audience. You probably won't get any walkouts, you never know, but it is a good idea to have for that awareness. I think that's really important to do. And the same this goes if you're giving a presentation or something as well, anything that you are leading at a convention space, it's kind to do that. It's a base level of kindness towards your audience.
Yeah, for 30 seconds. For the space of 30 seconds that it takes you to warn people, it does a lot of service to the audience and to any other speakers on the panel. I had actually just remembered one other thing in terms of preparing people for the panel at the start, and it's because of one of my first Worldcon moderations. I was on a panel about comics with Paul Cornell, C. Murphy, and Santa Takeda. Santa Takeda does not speak English. So for this panel, we had to make sure that the other panelists knew and that the audience knew that every single thing that was said would have to be interpreted for Sana before she could contribute. So it was going to be long delays between every single sentence so that she could participate fully. And that's something we had to communicate at the beginning. And I think it's relevant to bring it up now because Worldcon is likely to have international speakers at it who English isn't going to be their first language. Even if they don't have an interpreter and they can speak English to some degree, they might need more time to process what's being said. And it is something that people need to be more mindful of. It's easier to forget when you're in your own country at a local convention, but once you go to something that's in any way international and brings in international audiences and speakers, it gets more complicated, and you need to kind of check with people what sort of allowances they need and make sure the audience know why there's delays in the conversation, because it's not that people don't have anything to say, it's that they want to leave room for other people to speak.
And I'm going to chime in with accessibility and say it also, if you have any deaf panelists, you are going to want interpretation for them, whether it's writing it down so that they can see what's being said or sign language interpreter. And again, letting your audience know that that's the situation. And I know a lot of people also have auditory processing disorders. There's quite a few, and it's okay if you have one and you just need to take a moment to process what was said. That's fine. Just let your panelists know that that's the issue. You don't even necessarily have to tell the audience on that one, depending on how much of a delay you have, but definitely let your panelists know on that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that definitely leads into how you manage the conversation flow, but I'm guessing that's something we'll move into in a bit. See, watch me managing the conversation flow. The problem with this panel is all three of us are experienced moderators, and we did chat before the panel that there's a strong possibility we will moderate each other, but we will try to, do so and model good practice, hopefully. I won't interrupt again.
It's okay. I actually invited you both to moderate if you felt like it was necessary. Well, to help moderate during this if you felt it was necessary. Because out of the three of us, I have the least experience with moderating itself. So I am going to defer.
Voice. Also, this is the thing as well. We've been talking about what are generally in-person experiences. We're recording online. There are program items that run online at a lot of conventions now. There's got to be lag. Myself and Kat are constantly talking over each other because there's a slight lag on Kat's end for me. So Kat doesn't hear me speak until I'm halfway through my first few words. And that's something you need to be mindful of when you're dealing with people who don't necessarily know each other. Mm-hmm. We're at least friends, so if we speak over each other, we're not getting insulted and we pause for each other. But that's not always going to be the case.
Yeah, again, that comes down to conversation flow and less so audience, because your audience is at one remove when you're online. Generally, not always. Sometimes they are in the same Zoom call as you or what have you, but largely a lot of conventions that run online will have that level of separation between the panel and the audience in some way. And there's usually some way to interact between them, but it's not going to be as if you're in the same room and you can see the audience, which is also a very, very different experience, both as a moderator and a panelist, because you can't see your audience. But yeah, I'm guessing we'll back to that as well.
We will be coming back to this because I definitely want to talk about moderating specifically for online and how it is different from in-person. But before we did that, I wanted to talk a little bit more about our own particular methods for in-person so that we actually have the good juxtaposition between in-person and online. So I think that the first question for moderating in person is, how do you even start? Actually, this would be for both, moderating in general. How do you even start? How do you think about your questions? I'm throwing a lot at you. I promise that I'm not actually asking all of you to answer all of these questions at once. I'm just explaining what I'm getting at here. But like, how do you start thinking of questions? How many questions do you think of? Do you go question to question to question to question, or do you keep it conversational and just make sure you touch on everything, but you know what you're going to end on, etc.?
So we're talking more in the planning stages,
Yes.
pre-convention here. Yeah, Paul, do you want to lead off, or I can?
I always find a good starting point is to read the description and make sure that you're actually going to be covering the points that the program item was designed for, because that's what people signed up to talk about. And then beyond
and signed
that,
up to listen to.
And signed up to listen to, yes. But then beyond that, it's I would look and see what other people's, if it's not talking about a pop culture thing, if they're talking about how to write certain things or how to engage in certain areas, I would look and see what their experience levels are in those fields, so that if I need to direct a question at one person in particular, I know who they are and what their experience levels are, and then I don't also blindside someone by accident by asking them, name 4 PhDs on this topic.
You're referring to the panelists there.
Yes.
He's talking. Yeah.
What did I say?
You didn't say anything, so I just wanted to clarify that you weren't talking about just people in general.
No, the panelists. Yeah, no, you're not going to blindside. You're not going to target the audience with questions. That'll be a whole other moderator style.
Really different. Yeah.
To clarify, all three of us are friends, and we will kind of give each other a hard time.
No.
Never. I know that for me, because of anxiety, I like to have things planned. I want to make sure I'm not going to mess up, because failure is literally my biggest fear, which is super great when you're co-running a convention. But like, if it's on pop culture, if the description or the notes mention specific things, I look into those specific things. Usually I know those specific things already. I wouldn't have volunteered to be on the panel or moderate it if I didn't, but I'll rewatch it or reread it so that it's fresh in my brain, and I'll take notes as I'm doing that to think of questions. If it's on, like Paul was saying, if it's like how to write a specific thing. For instance, I did a panel at 2022 Octocon on writing YA, and I had quite a few YA authors. And I tried to read at least one book that each of them had written so that I could ask specific questions and know that they would get answered. And if you're lost, you can also reach out for help. I've had quite a few times where I've asked Paul to help me think of questions. As an example, we did a comics panel last year, and I was straight up of like, I can moderate it, I can facilitate the discussion. I do not know enough to be able to think of enough questions on my own. So if you help me formulate the questions, I can ask them.
I will say that is something you can actually do with your panelists. You can say, is there anything in particular you want to talk about in this, in case I don't think of it myself? Like, talk to your panelists in advance.
That note, that is one of the things that I try to reach out, especially with Octocon where it's smaller. But I will reach out to my panelists and say, this is the panel, this is what we're talking about, these are my thoughts of what to talk about. Is there anything in particular you would like to talk about? Equally, is there anything you want to stay away from? Because an example, I'm pulling examples. Sorry. We were
Fine,
not sorry.
Not
actually sorry.
I've got them.
We were doing a panel on cosplaying while neurodivergent or sorry, I'm tripping over my words. Or with various physical disabilities. And obviously this is a panel that you want to be careful on, that you aren't going to be asking people to be really super personal on. But you're also asking them to be relatively open. So what are you comfortable talking about? What are you maybe comfortable talking about? And what do you absolutely not feel comfortable talking about? So.
Yeah, I mean, my approach is pretty much the same. It's research. If it's a topic I know well, and I'm moderating people I know well, then yeah, I've been known to rock up and write some questions down about 10 minutes before, but that's only because it's already there established. With panelists, I don't know, especially, and even when I do know them well, it's always best to reach out and like Kat said, ask, what do you want to talk about on this topic? What have you got any particular, interests in this that you really want me to touch on? Because sometimes people will mention things and you really, really do want to make a point of mentioning that at some point during the panel because it's just so interesting or funny or just incredible, that you want to make sure this person gets their chance to say this thing because it's such a cool thing. It's a good way to sound out as well what kind of panelists you have, because and this varies on the top of your panel. Sometimes you have a panel full of experts on the topic, and sometimes you have a panel full of people who just have opinions on a topic, and that's also cool because especially pop culture ones, that can lead to some really fun conversations. And sometimes you have a mixed panel where you have people who are experts in particular fields that apply to this, and some people who just have a wide breadth of knowledge, or the pop culture side of it. And it's knowing what they all want to kind of cover in this, and then looking at it and seeing what questions you can build from that. I would say definitely go in, as Paul said, look at if you've got enough of a detailed description, which you don't always, especially for Worldcon, where you might just get a one-liner and not like our very carefully handcrafted Octocon paragraphs. But have a look, see if there's any questions contained within the panel description itself, or anything that can be a question, because that gives you an immediate theme to work from. And again, like Paul said, presumably that's what people have signed up for and what the audience want to come along for. So you want to address those questions. And if you can think of a few more on top of that, I mean, it's kind of a bit of a weird rule of thumb, because sometimes you just don't know how much material you're going to get out of a single question. You need at least, I don't know, and you two can correct me, please correct me on this. I'd say you need at least a good bank of 8 or 9 questions. You are probably not going to get through all of them. So pick what is most important, and go with those first, and try and get a flow as well. I mean, it's a really good idea to have a flow through your questions if you can. And this will come back to moderating style, as to how, do you just ask the questions, or you doing a conversation that things change a lot. But you can't go wrong with having a base set of questions to work from, even if you don't use any of them during, at least you've got them, because you never know when the panel is going to dry up. Because even if you know your panelists really well, sometimes you just run out of stuff to say on a particular thing, and you need to find something to work from. So do your reading if you can. I moderated a panel at Octocon last year where I went off and read like an entire four volume set of books, because I knew nothing about this particular author. I knew the underlying folklore from the stories. So I went and read the books, and I read the fantastic foreword, and I actually used quite a lot of that in what I was talking about as part of the panel for my questions. So you never know what's going to come in useful. I'm a kind of a jobbing moderator in that I don't really mind what the topic is, as long as it's something I've got a vague amount of knowledge in or can read up on quickly. Not touching comics either. But I do like them. I just don't know enough about them, and that's another story.
Things I can moderate on.
Yeah,
this particular one was.
But and I mean, if you have, again, this kind of comes back to even before we get to the stage. If you've been asked to moderate something, and it's a topic you're really not comfortable with, because you really don't think you're either going to get enough of an understanding of it in time, or you're going to know what questions to ask, turn it down. It's okay. You can do that. You don't have to do everything that people ask you to do at conventions. You really don't. It's okay. We would rather you turn it down, and we'll go ask somebody else, and you go away being happy. And the same if you're asked to moderate a panel and you think, actually, I'd be better off talking on this panel. I'd be better off as the expert who's answering the questions. Again, it comes down to type of moderator sometimes. Do you want a moderator who knows just enough to ask the right questions? Or do you want a moderator who knows so much they can ask really, really incredible questions? And sometimes it's the topic. It depends on what the topic is. Like, some science things, you're going to want somebody with a good breadth of knowledge, so they know exactly the right things to ask. Pop culture, general knowledge of it is sometimes enough to be able to elicit really good stuff. Anyway, getting back to the question. which which really Kat should be prompting me to. So the question was originally
but it was making sense, so I'm going to, like I said, my style is conversational.
That's true. It is really just do your research, write some questions in advance, get help writing those questions, and that help can include your panelists. Ask them if there's anything they want to talk about in particular. Ask them if there's anything they don't want to talk about in particular on that topic, because there very often is. There might be stories they don't want to touch on, and make sure you make a note of those as well. And if you can, get your panelists talking to each other, even if it's just an email thread. And obviously, once you're at the convention, and this may be preempting Kat a bit, I don't know, if you've got a green room, and even if you don't, use it. Get together with your panelists for at least a 10-minute chat, because that gives you a chance to find out what their conversation style is like, especially if you've never met them before. Because some people speak slowly, some people speak quickly and don't shut up. I mean, naming no names here. Some people just don't shut up. So it's good to have a sense for how they speak and what kind of level you need to go in at as well. And again, it gives you another chance to say, so I was going to ask about this. Are you happy with that? Or have you got any more things you've thought of that I can add to my list of questions just in case? So I will stop talking now.
It's okay. To kind of answer my own question on how I go about questions, but also to follow up on Catherine saying 8 or 9 questions minimum, just to make sure you have enough. My own style is very bullet point, and so I know what, like, the broad base of what I want to cover, and then I have sub bullet points so to make sure that I'm like keeping on track. But because my style is conversational, I also let things go where they go, and I'll just redirect back to this as needed if it is actually needed, because sometimes where it's going is really interesting and it is on topic, so I'm going to let it keep going that way. But I know which questions I'm starting on, and I know which questions I'm ending on.
Yes, that's always a good way to do it.
I know how I want to wrap it up. And sometimes it means that I have the last 2 questions, because the second to last question leads into the last question, and it leads in how I want it to. So, but that's my style. And so after a recent panel, one of the people on the panel asked me afterwards if, like, did we actually touch on everything you wanted to touch on? Did you get to ask all of your questions? And I was like, well, we touched on everything I wanted to touch on. We asked the important questions, but did we use all of my questions? No, I still had another 5 that I could have asked if I needed to.
That's absolutely fine. You're better off having too many than drying up in the middle. And I have been the person drying up in the middle, and it's horrible. It's actually, and sometimes it doesn't help with if your panelists also dry up, or you have panelists who like giving 3-word answers, and that comes back to the style of how you ask your questions as well, is asking open-ended questions rather than ones that are just a yes or no, because if you answer something that can be just answered with yes, then it's
I've because I'm embracing my my heritage of being a white guy, I've started a podcast, and every white guy has to have a podcast at some point. How else should other white? And I've been doing some research into how other people manage it. And one person who has produced like a couple of dozen, I think, at least, and she's like award-winning in a few different, and quite a lot. Her advice for when people are having podcast guests on, that's kind of the same for moderators, except that usually podcast guests are one at a time. But she will prepare 10 questions, prioritize 5 as the 5 she really wants to get to, and then if she doesn't get to the other 5, that's fine. But it's having those 5 really important ones that you really want to try cover within the time slot, because she's working in the same sort of time slot that a panel would at a convention.
Yeah. I never know whether to be disappointed or absolutely delighted when the panelists start talking about something. The conversation drifts into something that I have a question for further down the list. I mean, yeah, I'm usually delighted, but at the same time, it's like, oh, damn, what if we run out?
So, I have run out. I have had that happen. Whereas, like, you guys actually already answered my question like 20 minutes ago.
Yeah. In that case, you cut to the audience, I think, at that point.
Yeah, which is what I did. But one thing I've started doing, and it helps if there's a table in front of you. There isn't always a table in front of you. Take notes during the panel. And if someone mentions something, yeah, Catherine's doing it. I'm also doing it.
I'm typing up my notes. So.
Yeah, if someone mentions something and it's relevant to one of your questions, you have a way of saying, "Oh, and just to come back to that thing you said earlier," and you can just naturally bring up one of your questions that you wanted to ask in a way that they don't realize you prepared that question. All they know is you took note of a book title or a movie or a quote, and you just wanted to bring the conversation back in that way because you thought it was interesting. It's a little cheat to make the conversation sound natural, but it's for the audience's benefit as well.
Yeah, it works though. I mean, it really helps the conversation flow. And sometimes you are, oops, I'm so sorry, my phone has just gone off. And sometimes you are making notes that, you haven't thought of. So you're going to want to pull them in. Also, turn your phone off during panels.
Unless you're like me.
Well, not turn it off, turn off this.
Turn it on silent, yeah.
Yeah, turn it on silent. I mean, I use it to keep track of time, which is another thing we did not mention, but yeah, keep an eye on time.
The reason I say unless you're like me is because I have various vision issues. So being able to enlarge my text or change
I
the
didn't mean
color
turn it off.
Important.
I just meant turn it silent.
This is also part of the managing expectations with the audience. When I am doing a panel in person, I have the notes on my phone. And so I will just say I promise I'm not being rude when you see me looking at my phone. I'm taking notes to make sure that I'm able to follow up on questions. All my notes are here so that I can enlarge it, so that I can see it. And it's also so that I can keep track of time. So it's all right there.
The same kind of goes for online panels as well, because in online panels you'll often see me staring down, and it's because I'm taking notes. So it's kind of good to say, look, if you see me looking away from the camera, I am paying attention. Just really paying attention, but I'm writing things down.
Also, with online, everyone's looking down to look at the other speakers, but the camera is above. So everyone is looking like they're not paying attention because they're not looking where the audience
unless
is
they're
looking.
very experienced in Zoom calls or have the sense to, but not the sense, but put on speaker view so you get only looking at the speaker at any given time helps as well. But that's a whole different story. And we're drifting off topic into different topics and possibly answering questions Kat was planning to ask later. I
would like to brag on one of my panels real fast of like what to do if things start to go a little bit wrong. With me and my vision issues, one of the things that happens is every once in a while my eyes don't focus. And I just need to give it a moment, kind of let it reset, and then I can look and read what I've written again. And this was also at the time when I realized that I had run out of questions, but I didn't know that because I couldn't see. So and I just had to say to my audience and panelists, I'm very sorry. This is not actually something to worry about. This is a known thing. It's just I can't actually read. So please just give me a moment to recalibrate my eyes, basically, and then I can read my notes and know what it was that I wanted to ask. And my rockstar panelists, the main ones on this, it was Sarah Reese Brennan, who was our guest of honor last year, and Ruth Francis Long, who's one of our guests of honor this year. And they kept the panel going while my eyes did their thing. They asked each other questions because they're longtime friends, but they also asked one of our other panelists I'm pretty sure it was her first year at Octocon. So they directed questions for her to answer as well. And then my eyes, resorted themselves and I'm able to see again. And I see that I don't actually have any more questions. So I just let them keep going for a while before I directed it to the audience to open it up for the audience to ask questions.
It's not a bad emergency tactic, is to say to your panelists, so have you got any questions that you want to ask the other panelists about this? And just, if in doubt, just throw that hot potato over and just, stop panicking.
I'm temporarily blind.
You
don't have to claim temporary blindness if that is not one of your things.
We've kind of, can we go back to getting panels going, because we were talking a lot about what to do pre-con and we kind of didn't really finish that up. apart from me talking about if you've got a green room, try and get talking to your panelists beforehand. And if you've not moderated before, it can be quite daunting to be sitting there at that table with three or four other people. It's like, where do I sit? Do I sit in the middle? Do I sit at one end? I mean, number one, make sure you've got a microphone in front of you and your name tent if you've got one. And where you sit is entirely how you want to do it. I like sitting at the end because I can kind of look that way and see everybody in a line and not keep having to turn my neck. But I've also got a dodgy shoulder. So that's another reason for me liking doing that. Some people would rather sit in the middle. It's completely, personal.
I prefer to
sit on the end, but that's because I have a rollator. So the rollator is at the table next to me.
I prefer to sit at the end so that I can see all of the panelists, and it helps me to spot. And it helps me spot immediately if I have been accidentally ignoring one.
That's a good point, actually. If you're sat in the middle, it's very easy to forget about the people.
You can focus on one side.
Yeah.
And if people sit in such a way so that this happened to me on a panel where I wasn't moderating, but there were 2 pros on one side of the moderator, and then 3 people who were working but not professionally on the other side of moderator. So he accidentally split it into pros and amateurs and treated the questions as such. Ooh. By accident, I would say.
Yeah.
But because he sat in the middle, he didn't give anyone else a chance to even be seen in the same line of vision as them. So his questions were, these are the pros working in this industry. Oh, and you guys also do this thing. And I was slightly annoyed over how it was done, but also I think it was his first time doing it.
Yeah.
But it's why I think you should put yourself on the end so that you don't accidentally cast your own biases on your questions.
That's a really good point. And it means the panelists aren't stuck with you in the middle having to talk around you.
Yeah.
If they want to speak to it, I mean, they're still going to have to talk around whoever's in the middle of them, but they're not having to talk around the authority figure in the middle, as it were. That's actually really good advice. But again, if you do prefer to sit in the middle, that's fine. Just be aware of these things. Take that into consideration. Make sure everyone's getting their due share and attention. Lean back occasionally so they can talk across you. It's like managing a particularly fine a big dinner party in the Regency era or something like that, making sure the conversation goes where it's supposed to. It's not quite now everybody talk to the person on their left. Now we've changed on the fish course, everybody talk to the person on their right. Sometimes it feels like that. But yeah, that's a good point about sitting at the end. Make sure you got your mics, make sure everyone else has got their mics.
Make sure the mics are working. And if they're not, ask the tech person in the room to try to fix the mics.
If there is no tech person in the room, ask the runner in the room. If there is no runner in the room, ask for a volunteer from the audience to go out and find one.
Yeah. And if worse comes to worse, you tell the panelists, it seems like one of the microphones isn't working. Who is comfortable sharing with the person beside them? Don't try not force people to share. They might know each other, but if 2 people know each other, they might be willing to share, because then they'll be able to say, oh yeah, well, I know this person wants to speak now, so I can hand over the mic easily enough without feeling like no, they can't speak because the other person has the mic.
Yeah, that's really good point.
Even if you are like me and you have the gift of projection, please use the microphone anyway, because it really does help keep things clear for people in the audience to hear it if they have any type of hearing or auditory processing issues.
And also a lot of panels are live streamed these days. If you're at a hybrid convention, they need to be able to capture your audio successfully. And there's nothing more frustrating, having been an online attendee, as sitting there and having somebody mumbling away from the mic and not knowing what the question was asked, and then having somebody answer that question with something that sounds really interesting, but you've no idea what it's actually in relation to, or vice versa.
But the same as if you take questions from the audience. People online aren't necessarily going to be able to hear those questions properly, and people in the room mightn't be able to hear the questions properly either. So repeating those questions back, as you'd said before, is a good way of making sure everyone knows what's being asked. And
I think that was in the preamble before the panel started. We were talking about that. Yeah, we haven't discussed that yet. We'll get to that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's a good point.
Now.
Well, you can now, but I mean, that's we can go from how you start the panel to how you end the panel, and then we can go back to what's in the middle, I guess. If that works. But I mean, personally, I like to start the panel, as Paul said, by reading out the description. It also gives people a chance to go, oh, damn, I'm in the wrong room.
Yep.
And leave and go to the panel they actually wanted to be in, and that's not unusual.
I've
They're
had
not being rude. It's just they've gone into the wrong room. It happens quite a lot.
They want the other panel.
Yeah, they meant to go to the other panel. So and then I'll generally not introduce myself first, apart from to say my name. I will let my panelists introduce themselves, and I will not introduce them themselves, if that makes sense. But sometimes I'm not too sure. So it's a good idea to always check beforehand what your panelists want to be called, what name they want to be called by, what's the pronunciation, what are their pronouns. So you've got all of that preferably written down so you know it. So if somebody goes by a couple of different names, my friend Laura Ann, for instance, you're not calling her Laura. You're making sure that you use the right pronouns, and you can again model good behavior by when you introduce yourself. And we did not do this in this panel, which was pretty rubbish of us, frankly, by saying Catherine Sharp, she, her.
Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. We've actually missed that one. And keep going. And some of the panelists will pick up and also use their own pronouns and won't, but that's it's personal choice anyway. But yeah, let them introduce themselves. Ask them to say one or two sentences about themselves, because sometimes people will go into a whole big pitch about what they're there for, and what they want to talk about on this panel, which is fine. Again, we're going back to expectations, though. If everybody is going to do that, that's great.
Say different
but
things.
If they're not, then you might have one person, especially people, because we do have a mix, as Paul was saying, we have a mix of people who are professional writers, for instance, and people who are amateurs, or people who are knowledgeable about this bit of business and people who aren't. And that's good, because it makes for a really interesting conversation. But, if somebody's sitting there listing off their bibliography, and you're just going, I'll just do this for a hobby, it's quite daunting, and it can put people in quite awkward positions. Sometimes I will
I've
get
been a
them to
panelist like that.
Yeah.
I pulled out of a panel because everyone else on it had PhDs.
But I mean, sometimes I will start the panel by saying I'd like them to introduce themselves and give one or two sentences about what they want to talk about on this panel. Again, it's setting expectations and tell your panelists you're going to do that beforehand. Don't blindside them. Oh God, I've been blindsided. It's like, so introduce yourself and tell us what you want to do, and it's like, I haven't had a chance to think about it. Yeah, it's how fast can I think? And yeah, everything like I ever knew about this subject has just gone whoosh. So yeah, again, it's expectations. If you're going to do something like that, especially at the start of the panel, let your panelists know. So yeah, and then I will introduce myself but I will generally, because I'm the type of moderator who's just there to ask the questions, I will just generally say, my name's Catherine, and I'm how I'm involved in this convention, and I'm here to ask the questions.
Yeah, and telling people this is my interest in this area, and that's why I'm moderating.
Mm-hmm.
And then at least the audience know why you're the one asking the questions and not the one answering them.
Mm-hmm. And if you get, one of your panelists says, and this happens, this is my name, and I have no idea why I'm on this panel, don't react. It's awkward. It's really awkward. And usually they're on that panel because the people putting the panel together have actually seen a reason to put them on that panel. And this is experience. We've had put people on panels and they've said, I'm not sure why I'm on this. And sometimes they've had the sense to ask the programming team in advance, why have you put me on this? And we'll tell them. And sometimes they've just come up to us afterwards and said, oh, I see why you put me on that. And that's great. I mean, that's validation for us as a programming team. Hopefully it's validation for them as a panelist. The only thing you can do if somebody does say that is make sure that they're not the first person you ask a question of when you actually start asking the questions.
Oh.
And that you try and find a question. When you find a question that speaks directly to their strengths, ask them that first, so they get a chance to shine. Because what you get with questions sometimes is the first person to answer will have a really, really good answer. The second person will have a good answer. The third person is like, well, they've already said everything I was going to say.
Yeah.
And it, you know, and so
sorry.
no, go ahead, Kat.
Because I do tend to have specific questions for specific people, in that situation, I personally would just bump one of the questions specifically for that person right up that list.
Yep.
Like I would actually have that be one of my first questions. Maybe not the first one, because like I said, I know what my first questions are.
The one thing I'll say,
this is going to be part of starting. Depending on the topic, if it is something that we're talking about a very specific thing, I do, after introduction, after reading the name of the panel, the description, and introducing ourselves, I will ask us to actually define the term and what we mean when we're talking about it in this particular panel. So that is usually my first question, because I think it's really important that we all be on the same page.
Yeah, that's a really good idea for something which is can have different interpretations, which isn't going to be everything, but
one thing that we hadn't mentioned, aside from giving your pronouns, it's something for people who have sight difficulties. You describe what you look like and what you're wearing, so they can picture it. It is, I've seen it quite a bit in online programming during the pandemic. Not a huge amount of in-person programming, but there are people who have difficulty seeing, and they mightn't necessarily know what someone looks like who's actually speaking. So they have no way of differentiating people in their head just based on voices.
That's interesting, yeah.
It takes practice though, because it's awkward trying to describe yourself like that first time.
It is. It's like people writing alt text, which is functionally not very useful, really, isn't it? And
one of my favorite alt texts. No, that's tangent. Sorry.
Yeah, tangent. That's tangent.
It's a total tangent.
Too much of a tangent, even for us.
Most of the time, my tangents do connect. This is just a tangent. But I think actually, since we have kind of talked more about how we start, a little bit on how we finish, let's get back to how we finish, actually, because we were talking about managing questions, managing the audience, which is usually how we tend to end panels, is with audience participation. So what do you do if, for instance, somebody's not asking a question, they are giving you an opinion?
I'm going to say a bit about wrapping up the panel beforehand, actually, which is to do the whole, have one last question that you definitely want to ask, and have another last question that you're going to wrap up with after the audience Q&A happens. And depending on how long your panel is, if you've got a 60-minute slot, you're going to probably want to leave maybe 20 minutes for audience questions. Because if you don't get enough of them, you can always go back to the questions you have. 10 minutes in a 50-minute panel, 10 minutes for questions is generally not enough. I've found you do need 15. Because you do get people, as Kat just alluded to, who will stand up and give more of a comment than a question. There's a reason this is a line that is mocked greatly online in various memes and things. Stop them. If they start rambling, they might have some really interesting things to say, but they are not the panelists. So if it's going on for a couple of minutes, maybe even less, feel free to interrupt. You have the mic, you are the moderator. Ask them what the question is. And sometimes even the question, sometimes someone will stand up and also ask quite a long question. If you can, paraphrase it, repeat it back in a sentence, you know, because they'll have wanted to put, you know, examples of things maybe and ask, you know, so based on this book and this scenario and all the rest. So if you can distill it back and ask it quickly, do it. And as Paul said before, always, and I think, well, maybe Kat, whoever it was, somebody said it. Repeat the question back if you can, because it's for the benefit of the audience, especially if there's no roving mic. Always repeat the question back, because there'll be people at the back of the room who won't have heard it. There'll be people online who definitely won't have heard it. And it just helps concentrate the panelists.
I had to repeat questions for Santa K's interpreter so that she could interpret properly.
Never be afraid to repeat a question that you've already asked as well, even during normal conversation, because sometimes by the time two people in your panel have talked, the person who's next can't remember what the question is. So, you know, just ask it again if you have to.
That. Yeah, they might start saying, "Oh, I forgot what the question was."
Yeah, because you know. But going back to the audience, don't be afraid to stop them. Don't be afraid to say that question isn't appropriate for this panel, I was talking about the panel on sentient/AI spaceships. Somebody did stand up and ask, so what about AI, referring to current stuff? And I said, look, this is not the panel for that question. If you think you'd like to see it discussed, please submit it in the suggestion box for next year. You know, because it's panel in itself. You know, it's not something we can answer in 2 minutes at the end of another panel. So yeah, don't be afraid to be firm. Some people will get shirty. This is true. Some people will be like, but by and large, the audience will thank you for it. Your panelists will thank you for it.
And as the moderator, you have to be the villain in the situation sometimes.
Unfortunately, yeah.
I was going to say,
mean. We're not condoning being mean, but you know,
No.
politely,
just
firmly establishing boundaries.
Yep. Please, can you ask the question? And if they still don't ask the question, stop them again. Ask them to ask the question. And
I will say, so when it comes to audience questions, you want to establish with the person who has the roving mic first that you're selecting who's speaking, so they don't go and hand the mic to someone. Don't just pick people who you know, because I've seen it a few times while I'm in the audience. The moderator will go, "Oh, we'll pass it to Brian there." So they're passing it to their friends or someone who they've seen quite a bit. And don't assume someone's gender when you're picking them out from the audience. I saw that as well as an audience member, someone saying, "Oh, this lady," and the person was dressed quite androgynously. So there was they weren't necessarily presenting as female, but they were being referred to as female by the moderator. And I called them out on it after, just to say, "Hey, didn't want to call you out in the middle of the thing, but you don't know that those people were male or female." So it's better to say this person in, say, the red top.
Yep, always.
Or this person in the front row, if there's only one person in the front row, because it's identifying features.
At the back with the black spectacles, use identifying clothing. Also, and if you do know somebody in the audience, and I'm really guilty of doing this, don't refer to them by name.
Yeah,
because it does look like you're only calling on your friends, even when you're not. So, and I'm very guilty of referring to people by name, especially at Octocon, where we know an awful lot of people, and it's probably not quite so bad, but it can look a bit sort of like you're only asking your mates.
Unless they're one of the guests at the panel.
Unless they're one of the guests, obviously.
If they're one of the guests, then you can name the guests.
If they're one of the guests of the convention, I think it's fair to call on them by name, yes, because you'd be expected to know who they are. But yeah, otherwise try and avoid going, so Brian, do you want to ask the next question? Unless, of course, you're going, Brian, can you be shut up now? Which, you know, if you, but again, that's, you have to be careful about doing that, because it can come across as being really mean, and it's not meant to be. It's a joke between friends. You have to.
Looks more like more like friends.
And this goes to talking to the panelists as well, because especially at Octocon, we're a small convention, we will very often have our friends on the panels, as well as people we don't know, and it's trying to balance that of treating everybody equally, and you have to treat the audience members equally too.
Yes. I am going to say something potentially controversial about audience questions.
Gasp.
It is okay to not open the floor to audience questions.
It is, so long as you make that clear up front in the panel. And also, this is something we forgot to mention about the upfront expectations. Sometimes you will get audience members who want to stand up and make their point, and will make their point from the floor while the panelists are talking. Again, you can choose at the start of the panel to say, we will be taking questions only at the end. Or if you think it's going to be a slightly different kind of audience or different kind of conversation, or you're comfortable in doing so, you can say, we will take questions during the panel. Please raise your hand and wait to be called on.
Yes.
And then in both those scenarios, you are perfectly within your authority as a moderator. If somebody just starts calling out questions from the audience, to ask them to please be quiet and let the panelists speak, because they're the panelists. If this person wanted to be on the panel, they should have replied to be on the panel.
And if they did and they didn't get on, it's because someone else made the decision.
And if they keep doing it, it is also within your realm as the authority in that room to ask for somebody to take them out, which you never, not in that kind of way, to escort them from the room. Please leave the room. you don't want to have to do that. You never want to have to do that, but they are causing a disturbance in a panel. And unfortunately, it happens. And sometimes it's people you know, for whatever reason, that is their personality. And sometimes you make allowances, and sometimes if it's causing a problem for the panel, if it's causing a problem for the audience, they are your primary responsibility.
Yeah.
So your job as moderator is to moderate, and that means that you are the one controlling the environment. And your job is not necessarily to be nice. It's not necessarily to be liked, and it is okay to ask people to leave. Obviously, we try to do other things before we hit that point.
We should probably touch a code of conduct at this point, yes. Then, because it leads in quite well.
It does. I know that Octocon has a code of conduct where it is listed, and you have to say that you accept the code of conduct and you will follow the rules of it when you are getting your membership. And so that way, if you do anything that crosses the code of conduct, and not like if you cross it, you are automatically kicked out, but Octocon is within its rights to kick you out for not following that code. Obviously, sort of like in this situation of we try to not jump straight to please leave the room. That's our last resort. But if the person is being a disturbance, if they're breaking the code of conduct,
they
will either follow it or not.
The code of conduct is there to protect the safety of the other participants at the convention, the other attendees, and also to ensure that their enjoyment isn't ruined by someone else's actions, both of which are valid regardless of whether someone thinks, well, I want to express my opinion. That's how I enjoy myself at these conventions, because they might be causing actual harm to somebody, or they might just be ruining the vibe for the entire room. And it's not, we don't have to make compensation for one person to feel good about themselves. But you remind people about the code of conduct if they're stepping out of line.
It becomes a lot more difficult when it's one of your panelists. Yes. I will say that. Because if somebody on your panel says something which is out of line, that is going beyond the bounds of what is allowed by the code of conduct. So obviously, if they're being abusive about somebody, if they're saying something extremely racist, homophobic, sexist, take your pick, anything along those lines, hopefully they wouldn't have been put on a panel in the first place, but sometimes it happens. We don't know everybody, as well as we'd like. And sometimes it's accidental. But if you, for instance, asked them, you kind of made it clear that they've misgendered somebody and they carry on misgendering somebody, this is just an example, or they carry on using specific terms that they should, just aren't acceptable, then you are well within your rights, again, as the moderator, to ask them to stop. And ask for, if necessary, send a runner for somebody in the committee if it really has to go that way. It's you have the power, and we mean that in a good way. I am going to use the line, with great power comes great responsibility. You have to use it in a way that is appropriate. But if you have to shut down parts, and sometimes the conversation will veer into something which is heading towards code of conduct territory, or it's getting into areas of things you've decided not to talk about for whatever reason. And again, you can shut that conversation down by saying that's not something we're talking about in this conversation, or that's not appropriate to cover right now.
And it is better coming from the moderator than from another panelist, because the last thing you want is for the panelists to be arguing on stage. It's better to have the moderator say, okay, we need to move the conversation away from this. Mm-hmm. Try not name what the problem is, because you don't want to draw more attention to it.
That said, it could be something you don't pick up and one of the other panelists does.
Yes.
So if a panelist says, I don't think that's appropriate, don't question it. Not at that point. Just say, okay, let's move on from that topic, or let's move on from that particular bit, and just move the conversation away.
Because even if it's not necessarily inappropriate, that panelist has made it clear that they are not comfortable with this topic. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
let's move to something else.
It could be anything. It might not be anything to do with the code of conduct level sort of stuff at all. It could be just part of the conversation you might stray into accidentally. You didn't think you were ever going to be talking about this particular topic in the context of this panel, and it's like, well, no, I don't actually want to talk about that right now. It's like, you know, it's like you could be something that touches on somebody's grief or something like that, and you just didn't expect it to happen, and it's not a good time if you're not prepared. So again, if it doesn't, it's good. It's best that the moving things on comes from you, but take your cues as needed,
Yes.
and enforce them as needed. Gosh, this got quite heavy, didn't it? But it's also really, it's actually one of the more difficult bits.
Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh. That just got heavy.
No, it did. It's one of the more difficult bits of being a moderator. But on the plus side, it very rarely happens. Like I've been moderating panels for quite a number of years now and moderated at quite different levels, and I've never really had that happen in one of my panels. I mean, I've had kind of let's move this on because this isn't what we're talking about, but yeah, I've certainly not got to the code of conduct level either. It's just something you need to be aware of and familiarize yourself with, and trust that there is a structure out there to help you and assist you and back you up, more importantly.
Very much.
Okay.
So we've talked about starting and we've talked about ending. Do we want to talk more about the middle, or do we want to now talk about the difference between moderating online and in person?
I actually have one more thing about ending.
Oh yes, please. Let's let you finish.
So when it comes to the very, very last question, I like to ask the panelists to basically give a takeaway for the audience, whether that's a book recommendation or just one last tip or something like that, just so that the audience are leaving on a high.
Yeah.
Regardless of where the conversation has gone up to that point, because you could be dealing with what starts as a fun topic, then gets really heavy.
Yeah.
So you want to have them leave on a positive note.
Yeah. My way of it is usually like, so I have one last question for the panelists, and I'd like them all to give one sentence about this thing. And then once they've given their one sentence about this thing, which sometimes is 5 sentences because that's how it happens, it's like, and thank you very much to the panelists, give their names, thank you to the audience, thank you to everyone who's asked a question. If you've been told, say what the next thing is in the room is happening.
Yep.
And then you're done.
I try to list off not just what's happening in this room, but what's happening in other rooms as well.
If you know.
Because maybe somebody really wants to go. Well, I happen to know because I have the schedule.
Yeah. but you're not always going to know. It depends
Yes.
whether you've been given the schedule.
And it's not possible at Worldcon because there's like 12 rooms.
Yeah,
at
that would take you half the panel.
Yes. At Worldcon, just say what's next in the room if you can. And I also try to remind people to please feel free to check out our trade hall and our artists and creators there.
Especially if you're on a creative panel. If you want to remind people that. Yes. Hey, there's creatives in this building. You can go say hi to them.
If you've got authors who are on the panel with you and you know they're having a signing or something later as well, plug it for them. Don't be afraid to plug things for the people you have on the panelists, even if they haven't mentioned it themselves. Sometimes they're a bit too shy. They're not, or they forget. They forget.
I've done that on a panel.
So many times they forget. So, kind of go, oh, so Paul will be in the trade hall and Sarah Spanner will be signing later, and just kind of do it if you know. I mean,
and Ruth Francis Long is going to be giving a reading, and
don't feel bad if you don't know, but if you do, it's nice. It's nice. It's just a nice way to wrap up. Like Paul said, it leaves everyone with a nice feeling.
As a panelist, I plugged someone else's Kickstarter at the end of a panel because she didn't.
Yeah, I will just add for wrapping up, sometimes depending on your panel, your program schedule, like we run half an hour between items now at Octocon, and we're certainly doing that at WarCon, so there's plenty of time to get around. But our old style used to be 50 minutes in a 60-minute slot, so you needed people to get out of the room and get to the next thing. So don't be afraid to say, right, everybody out, literally push people out the door. I have had to do that because I was being followed by a George R.R. Martin signing, and that was quite awkward.
You don't want to
definitely need to get people out of the room fast.
And I did get, and I had to move people on because people will come up to the panel, the top table as well, to talk to the panelists. That happens a lot, and if you do have a tight time frame, you are going to have to be forceful about moving people on. And if you can, and if there's people around who are involved in like the rovers or ops or whatever you call them, staff who can help with that, that's great.
And
I think a
you
good
can,
idea
if you
there.
have the time, you can say, I would like to continue this conversation. Could we continue it
Yes,
right
absolutely.
there
Absolutely.
outside the room?
Let's continue this out in the where the sofas are.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
let's do that.
And especially if lots of people have hands up for questions, which are coming to the end of the panel, you can say, okay, we have to end the panel, but if any of our panelists are able to stick around, we can move this conversation outside. But they might have to run off, go somewhere else.
And you'll find if a lot of hybrid conventions will have a Discord server and somewhere people can talk about the panel online as well. So that's always a good thing to plug and send people off to.
And that's exactly what I was going to mention, especially for Octocon. Because I know that we've had a fantastic time continuing the discussion even the next day because it was still going. So we're like, oh, I guess we're not closing this one yet.
It's great for recommendations and things like that as well.
Yes, I was going to say that.
And plugs, you know,
and
get your
plugs.
panelists to plug themselves, but their websites and Etsy shops, what have you.
So I think that this does actually lead into online. So we're going to talk about online now. And just to be clear, when I ask, would you rather talk about this now or this? I will make the decision. I'm just asking you guys if there's a particular way you'd like to go. Which way are you being led to go now? But right now we're going to talk about online and the differences, because when you are moderating in person, you can say, we're just going to go straight down the table. And you can't do that in a Zoom call.
Nope.
People are in different places.
Yeah, for that, I will, before it goes live or before it starts recording, if I'm moderating, I will tell people what order I'm going to call on them for to introduce themselves, because it's not necessarily going to be in a line as you might expect it to be. So it gives them a sense of, okay, I know I'm next, and I know I'm next, so they can prepare mentally, because how they appear on, say, the Zoom window isn't necessarily how they're going to appear for the audience either. They could be in different positions based on who the producer is. They might have put them in different spaces on the screen if they're using something like OBS. So just telling them who is going to speak next, introduce themselves in advance, the order they'll speak in, means that no one is caught off guard.
Typically, if you're doing an online panel, you'll be asked to show up and log into the Zoom or what have you at least 10-15 minutes before. There might be tech stuff that needs to happen. Not always. Sometimes it's just a flat out Zoom. But it also gives you a chance to treat that as your green room and talk to your panelists, which is really, really helpful. Again, get a feel and to brief them on things like Paul just said. The main thing for me is just, so I'm one of those panelists who likes to ask everybody the same question as much as possible. And if there is, sometimes there'll be a specific question targeted to one person for a very strong reason, but I try and make it clear to the audience, again, manage expectations, why only that person is getting that question. Because sometimes if you're asking very different questions of very different people, it can look really awkward, as in Paul's previous example of the Pro-Am one. So it helps to kind of go, so Sarah, you've especially done this, so you know. So I am one, going back to what I was actually saying, I am one of the people who likes to kind of go through people in order, and that lends itself, in my opinion, to online panels a bit better than a more, you still want the conversation to flow, but in online it's a lot harder to get that natural interrupts. Again, you might have lag. People might only be able to see themselves on screen depending on how things are set up. You know, there's lots of different factors as to what, some people might not even be appearing on video, so it's a lot harder to get that kind of, to use the body language and those kind of cues to keep things going. So for me, it does tend to have to be a case of, okay, so now I'm going to ask this person, and now I'm going to ask this person, and sometimes it can feel a bit forced, but it's just it is the format. Unless you have people who know each other very well, like you can tell the three of us are quite used to talking over each other, but also knowing when to give each other space, and that's difficult with a panel who've people who don't know each other. So again, meeting them beforehand is good for that.
I've had worse. I've had worse. I've had two people know each other. The third panelist didn't know them, and then I was the moderator. So those two people actually, sorry, there were 4 people. One person barely spoke, so I just forgot he existed for a second. But the 2 people who knew each other dominated the conversation for a long time, and we started to ask each other questions. And I had to try pull the conversation away from them because they're going off topic as well, to try give time for the others to speak. Because when 2 people know each other on a panel, it's very easy for them to dominate the conversation.
It's a lot harder for you as moderator to interrupt as well in an online environment. Actually, talking about people dominating the conversation and going off topic, it's totally fine to go, so let's pull this conversation back to this.
Yes.
You know, it's you need to do it sometimes, and sometimes they've been off on a really fun tangent, and sometimes they've just got off topic, and it's kind of knowing when to pull it back and just you know, let people know that's what it's doing, because sometimes people will go, oh yeah, I did go off topic. Sometimes they won't notice, but sometimes they notice.
And you can say, I really enjoyed that tangent, but let's go back and
but going back to online, so Kat, what's your experience?
What I was going to say, because I really did try to not talk over people, but I do have lag, and so sometimes I talk over people. You're going to say your panelists' names a lot, and that is okay. It is going to sound weird to you. It probably is a little bit weird, but it's to make sure that people know when you are actually directing the question at them, when you are expecting a particular person. And even if it's a question that you're asking to everybody, it just lets people know when it's their turn. So like, we haven't necessarily had to do that a lot this time because we are very comfortable with each other. We tend to jump in. We're all quite comfortable talking, and so we will just jump in and talk. But if you have people who aren't that used to each other yet, or don't have that level of comfort, you're gonna have to use their names, and that's okay. Honestly, it's not weird.
That goes for in person as well, because you want to make sure this isn't something we've touched on at all, and it's making sure that your panelists are heard. And sometimes they're not all going to be heard equally, because some people will have more to say on a topic because they have particular knowledge on it, or sometimes it's just they're more long-winded. But that's one of the reasons I like asking everybody the questions, is because it means everybody gets a chance to say something. And even if they're just saying, oh well, yes, I agree with what they said, or I don't have anything to add, and sometimes I will ask the question, it'll be moving on to the next person, and you will say things like, Paul, do you have anything to add to that? Or what's your take on this? You know, it's giving them room to say whether they've got something to say or not, if that makes sense. But it is making sure they get the chance, and it's making sure people get that chance. They've been invited on the panel for a reason. We want them to speak.
And shake up the order that you ask the question, like, so that it's not necessarily literally going down the table.
No, don't do
like
that.
It's not, Catherine, Paul, Cat, Catherine, Paul, Cat. It's Catherine, Cat, Paul, Paul, Catherine, Cat, Cat, Paul, Catherine. Like, shake it up, and that way it's not just always the last person who's always the same being like, I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, and sometimes you will want to direct it based on what the question is and who it's for as well, again, because you might want the person with that particular bit of expert knowledge to speak first, to lay a grounding for everybody else to come in afterwards, or you might want them to be last because they will shore up what everybody else has said. So this sounds way more complicated, and to be honest, I think we're overthinking this a little bit, but it doesn't hurt to know it's something to take into consideration. We're trying to give you the audience, the moderators to be, we're trying to give you the tools.
We're all speaking from lots of experience, so we're picking up on lots of things that could go wrong and lots of things that you can do to make it work well.
I mean, when I started moderating, I used a hammer. That was my tool, and now I have a hammer and a wrench and a screwdriver and a,
I love that.
Oh, I thought you meant you literally would bang a gavel.
No, I literally did not take a hammer to my panelists.
I just have an anxiety disorder. When I find it also helps if you see someone put their hand up or look like they're trying to say something, so I call that person next.
Yeah.
Because otherwise they might lose their train of thought.
Yeah, that goes for online as well. You'll see people going.
And try say it as, oh, sorry, did you want to say something?
Or
And if they say, "Oh, it's gone now," it's like, okay, if it comes back, just raise your hand and I'll try to come back to you.
Yeah, saying things like, "Oh, Paul, it looks like you've got something you want to chip in about this," or or did you want to follow up on what Kat just said, because it's clear that there's a link there. It's definitely good to, and you can circle back to people within the same question. It's okay to go back to them if they look like they've got more, especially if it's part of the conversation flow.
And
it doesn't literally have to be person 1, person 2, person 3, person 4, and now everybody's answered. You can go back to person 1 now.
And now I go to question B. It's
I've seen that, and people go, "Oh, I just wanted to make one more point about that other question," and it's like, yeah, that moderator moved on too quickly. So they've made it so.
Sometimes it's not the moderator moving on. Sometimes the panelist. I've been the panelist to. I was asked a question and I was like, no, I've never had that happen. And then like 3 questions later, I was like, I have totally had that happen, and I actually need to get back to that because it's really important to touch on.
Again, if I can go back to something that was said earlier, it's okay to use all these tools to make the conversation work. You're still staying on topic as much as you can. You're still using the things you've prepped or that have come to you while you're actually doing the panel. Sorry, I'm losing my mic there. That's not good practice. And just I've derailed myself now by faffing my mic. So somebody else take over, please.
Well, on microphones, you don't necessarily need an amazing one, but you do need one that is going to catch your voice properly while you're speaking. I happen to be using one that's made for podcasting because I've just left it set up on my desk now.
Podcasting.
Oh, I had this thing for about 6 years before I ever used it.
I've got a really good mic as well, which I never use, so I can't talk.
I've just recently embraced being a white guy. So
if you are doing online, hopefully you'll have somebody on the call with you beforehand who will be managing the tech and will do a mic check for everybody, because it is really important.
And it might be that sorry, I'm tripping over my words. Frequently in that time, that's part of why you'll be asked to show up at least 10, 15, 20 minutes early. It's to do the mic test. It's to, Kat, would you mind just shifting your camera a little bit? Because right now we're not getting your face, we're getting something else.
Or you're appearing as a tiny little talking head compared to everybody else who is normal size. It's weird actually being on a call where everyone's heads are roughly the same size. I'm used to work meetings where people are like really different distances from the camera. Sorry, tangent, my fault there.
Tangents.
Well, it was still on topic, kind of ish. Is there anything else online then that?
I think that was just audience. Making sure that you know what the differences are. Yes,
and knowing where the audience questions are coming from, if you're having any. And it can vary. So really that just depends on the convention, but hopefully you will get audience questions. So
yes, if you're using the Zoom webinar feature, if the convention is using Zoom webinar feature, there should be a Q&A function that hopefully, well, the moderator should tell people put their questions in there rather than into chat.
Honestly, it's going to vary on what tech the convention's using, so I don't really think there's a lot of point going into it, but you might have to look out for them yourself, or somebody else will do it for you. It just really varies. So
if the convention hopefully you'll get them. Doesn't tell you beforehand, ask.
Yeah.
Like ask how questions are going to be handled, who's going to be passing them on to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or is somebody going to be passing them on to you, rather?
That too, yeah.
So I think that's mostly it for online. Was there anything in particular we wanted to talk about on the in-betweens, as we talked about beginning and we talked about end? Because clearly we don't do things linearly.
No, we've covered quite a lot of it.
Linearly.
We have covered quite a lot of it. I'm just looking at my notes. Timekeeping, which we've been absolutely rubbish at in this panel.
I gave up, I'm going to be honest.
Yeah, no, it's fine because we had a lot to say, and it's not. But again, you're probably, if you're running a panel at a convention, you're probably going to have to be a lot tighter on time. So if you're lucky, you will have people at the back of the room holding up signs going, "You have 10 minutes left. Stop." And generally, you should obey those signs because they're there for a reason. They're for everybody's convenience. And if people are holding up signs, just kind of give them a little nod so they know you've seen them, because otherwise they'll be there going, look at me.
If you are visually impaired and you can't see the
Yeah.
signs, you can elect one of the panelists to
Mhm.
notice the signs and like tap you or something
That's
if they're
a
the
good
one
idea.
sitting next to
Yeah.
you.
Again,
It's
like,
okay to
yeah.
have somebody else be the one to keep track of time if
Yeah.
you cannot see the signs.
Again, it's fine to set a timer on your phone as well and keep checking it. Generally have it on silent if you can, but if you want it on vibrate or something, I don't think anyone's going to mind. If suddenly starts playing like loud rock music in the middle of the panel, and that's a bit, or musical theatre, that's a bit more of a problem. But
Also for copyright, it might make the video
if
not
it's
be able
being
to go
recorded,
online.
that's the problem.
Yeah, you don't want audio playing through your phone just in case you make it so the convention loses their video.
Yeah, I'm just trying
This is possibly going to be because I can see you looking at your notes, Catherine. So to give you a moment to think of things,
carry on.
I'm going to be chiming in a little bit as accessibility officer Kat and as a person with various neurodivergences and various physical disabilities and stuff. It is okay to give yourself what you and your body needs. As an example, this is Bella, and I take her to quite a few conventions because she sits under my arm. It is a thing to help, like, it helps my body. This is literally a thing to accommodate my body as I need. I also have squishmallows and a few other stuffed animals that I use as cushions. It also helps me with my anxiety. I have taken them to the dentist. I have taken them to panels that I moderate. Paul helped carry them for me, actually. And he didn't realize I was using them as like physical help. He thought that they were just my emotional support animals and wasn't even questioning it. Which, to be fair, they are emotional support stuffed animals. But it's okay to do that. And if you are at a convention like Octocon, not only is nobody going to care that you're doing this, they're going to ask you in an excited way because they want to know more about your stuffed animals.
I watched a recording of one of this year's Eastercon panels that I was on and realized how much I fidget. Like,
I've been playing with rings on my hand the entire weekend.
Yeah, I'm basically my pencil is. Well, I mean, the good thing about being the moderator and taking notes is I have an excuse to have a pencil in my hand. So yeah, but I fidget with it so much.
I have moderated and been on panels as I'm crocheting or knitting, because one of my neurodivergences is ADHD. I struggle so hard to pay. If I try to sit still and pay attention, all I am paying attention to the fact is that I need to pay attention to. Like, that's it. I need to pay attention. I need to pay attention. And I can't actually pay attention.
Yeah.
So giving my hands something to do, and like we learned this way back in elementary school, because my teacher noticed that I did this, and she's like, Kat, do you enjoy crocheting? How about you crochet under your desk? See if that helps. And it helped. So I got to crochet under my desk. Back in the 90s. So yay, thank you so much, Miss Neely.
It's the whole, as long as you're not being disruptive.
Yeah.
Do what you need to be comfortable. Drink water during your panel. Please drink water during your panel. Take regular sips of water. You will need them, or whatever drink you have. But yeah, just
and I will usually say, like, when I'm starting off, when I'm introducing myself, I will usually say, I am crocheting because it helps me focus. It's not that I'm not paying attention. And people are okay with that because it's part of the establishing expectations at the beginning. If you give the explanation at the beginning, they tend to accept it. And if they don't, then that's on them. It's not on you.
And if you have to give it in the middle, that's also fine.
Yeah.
If something happens and you need to explain what's going on, then don't be afraid to kind of pause the panel for a sec just to.
I can't see. Please give me a moment.
Exactly. Carry on the conversation among yourselves, or I can't find my notes on my phone because I've just lost my internet connection. You know, shit happens. Just, you know, it's going to happen at some point, especially if you do a lot of panels. It's learning to be comfortable to ride with it. Again, you're the person in charge. You set the expectations of what is going to happen for this panel. You've set them with your panelists, you've set them with your audience, and doing that is probably that, and a bit of research is probably the most important things you can do to make sure a panel runs smoothly.
I am going to be honest. I have never been on a panel where things went completely 100% as we fully planned it, because it's a live performance, for lack of a better word, and things happen.
Yeah.
It is what it is. And it's not even necessarily bad things. It's just people think of something, or they realize that they gave the wrong answer to the question 3 questions ago, and they actually really need to look back.
I mean, by running smoothly, I mean not actively catching on fire. So that's kind of, I have quite a low standard on this one.
We did not cause harm. It is fine.
Yes, that is basically our base level.
The very first panel I was ever on at Octocon, I had just been to Garth Nix's book lunch and had Kat knows this story. I had 2 glasses of champagne or just sparkling wine, whatever it was, at like 11 in the morning. I was like on the way to being tipsy because I hadn't eaten anything since like 7 a.m. before going on to my first ever panel and sitting beside the guest of honor. It can't
my
get worse than that.
My first ever panel, I moderated the guest of honor, I think, but I mean, I was completely sober at the time, so that wasn't quite so bad. That's actually a good point. If you find yourself on a panel with big name people, please don't be intimidated. Yes, some of them, there will be some people who are very much don't you know who I am level people, but by reaching out to them beforehand and establishing what you're looking for and making it clear that you want your panelists to shine, you want everybody to have something they say on that panel that makes everyone go, oh, that was interesting, or that was really funny, or or oh, I'll go off and look about more of that, or I'll go buy their book. You want your panelists to have something to shine. So getting in touch with them beforehand, is if you're given the means to do so, is that even if it's only the 10 minutes before the panel, is really important.
And if you know one of the panelists and you're nervous about running the panel, you can tell them that so that they are aware, because that can help them help you. Namely, the Santa Takeda panel that I was moderating, I was nervous about it, so I told Katie Murphy, because I knew Katie and I knew that if I got up to say something, Katie could help drive the conversation along. Because if there's one thing Katie's really good at aside from writing, it's talking. And I mean that in a good way. Katie knows how to drive the conversation. So when Katie knew I was nervous, and largely because I wasn't sure how to deal with a panelist who wasn't speaking the language, Katie was able to help that along. And it turns out so was Paul Cornell. He also just decided to pick it up as well and just go, okay, yeah, I guess we're all helping on this, and just keeping the energy up on it, because keeping the energy up on the panel makes it easier for everyone. And if you're a first-time moderator, but you know one of the panelists, even only slightly, you know them enough to talk to them a little bit, let them know that you're nervous about first-time moderating, and see if they can help you keep the energy up in the room.
Yeah. This is jumping back to managing expectations, but because again, we don't do things linearly tonight.
It's late.
Setting the tone is important, and like laying out what you want the tone to be. So like if we're doing a panel on Star Trek, it might be really easy to think of some of the things we don't necessarily like about Star Trek, but let's try to keep it positive. We're like, tonight's goal is keeping it positive. We are here because we all love Star Trek, and that's what we have in common. That's what we're going to talk about. And that way, the panelists know we're trying to keep it positive. People asking questions when it's time for audience questions know that they need to keep things positive. If somebody mentions a Star Trek franchise that you are not particularly a fan of, you know to not boo it. Like it's setting the tone at the beginning so that people know we're here to be positive.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that every panel has to be positive. And I just pulled Star Trek off the top of my head because that's something I was talking about.
No, sometimes you want to talk about the negative. You want to talk about the negative side of things as well.
And when you're doing that, it's important to set that expectation as well.
And also try and keep some positive in there, because it can get very wearing if it's all negative.
Yes.
So there's that aspect.
One of the times that I did not do audience participation was at DCC this spring, because we were talking about disability representation in sci-fi and fantasy.
That's Dublin Comic Con for
particularly
those who don't know what
yes,
DCC
sorry,
is.
Dublin Comic Con, specifically focusing on live action adaptations, but we touched on other things. And the reason that I opted to not do audience questions is because that is a topic where it can get very, very quickly into audience members sharing their own experiences and then tacking a question on to make it a question.
Yep.
And we had enough questions for us to keep going. I made the decision that we're just keeping it among us to ask the questions. And sometimes that's the way to go, and other times that's not the way to go. So
we seem to be circling back over the same things again now. Does that mean we're
I
done?
think we do. Is there
that
anything in
means we're done.
particular before we get to the advice that we would like to have given ourselves but when we got started? Is there anything in particular that you can think of that we have not actually talked about tonight?
I can't think anymore, so I don't think so.
Okay.
We got everything. We got everything on my list.
This is why panels are not 2 hours long at conventions.
Yes,
Yes.
we have gone on a lot.
I'm very
Probably
sorry
won't
for
cut
how
this.
long, but I did want to make sure that we were covering everything. And since this is a pre-record panel, we do have the luxury of not necessarily having to stick to a strict timetable. But we also want to be kind to our panelists, and that is why you stick to the timetable as much as possible. Is there any advice that you wish you had received when you first started moderating?
It's a long time ago. I can't remember.
See, mine is much shorter. Like, there's a reason I said that I have been moderating the least amount of time among the three of us, because my first panel that I moderated was like 2 years ago. So
mine's over a decade, which isn't actually that long in convention terms.
Is there any advice that you give to people when you're helping them learn how to moderate? You're one of the people who taught me how to moderate. So was there any particular one piece of advice that you tend to think of?
I think just talk to your panelists beforehand, get an idea of what they do and don't want to talk about, and that leads into so much of the other stuff that we've talked about, like prepping your questions, managing expectations, all that kind of thing. I think Kat mentioned setting the tone. If you've got guidance from the convention itself, if you've got guidance from the programming team, the way we give a little bit of guidance to Octocon, saying, okay, so as well as a panel description, for instance, for the past few years, we've also given a few bullet points about this is the theme of what we think the panel should be about, and that can help as a starting point. You're not always going to get that. Sometimes you're going to have to figure it out for yourself.
Sometimes you just get a title.
Sometimes you just get a title, yeah. So, which is, we're kind of veering into horror story territory now, and I don't like that. It's not always that bad, kids.
We do want to keep this positive as much as possible.
But yeah, prep. It is prep. Prep. I think prep is probably the biggest one. Prep and decide and set your your own expectations as well as everybody else's.
Yeah, I wish I had known before Dublin 2019, which was my first time moderating. I don't have to say yes to moderating everything that I'm asked to moderate.
Yeah, I wish I'd known that as well.
Yeah.
Before my first Octocon. Yeah.
And I wish I'd been more prepared. I wish I'd gone and spoken to someone how to moderate, because having a list of questions to back yourself up can give you confidence in the room. And knowing what sort of approach you take when talking to your panelists before the convention, because often you'll get a list of email addresses shared. Not always, you won't always get them. People don't always choose to share them, but if you do get them, what do you say to people? Those sorts of things are what I would have loved to know before going into my first moderated experience. I also wouldn't have moderated for the first time at a Worldcon, but that was the next available opportunity.
It's fine.
It felt like a massive trial by fire. It was my first Worldcon. I was moderating for the first time. I was in the trade hall. It was entirely too much for 5-day period. But
that's fair.
But then the world ended, so I didn't get another Worldcon for 5 more years. So,
Kat, what do you want?
Think of advice. Oh no, I do. Sorry, I totally have advice. It's not necessarily advice that I wish I'd had, because I had very good teachers. Both Catherine and Paul helped me put together my first panels that I moderated, and they helped me put the questions together, and they gave me advice. So I was not lacking for advice. But if there is advice that I would give, it is, you have experience in life with, even if it's not necessarily moderating itself, you have experience and you have things that you have done that you can pull from. And it is okay to pull from those things. Not only is it okay, it is actually really good to pull from those things. Because as we know, I am a theater kid. I have lots of experience getting up and talking in front of people. And so I know how to lead a discussion. I know how to take the audience where I want them to go. All I had to do was figure out the questions. And that's, I'm not saying that to toot my own horn. I'm just saying that as this was already in my toolbox. I didn't have to rewrite it.
Yeah.
I didn't have to go out and buy new tools.
Yeah. If you've ever led a meeting at work, if you've ever led a seminar, if you've ever led, I don't know, lots of different things, if you've done public speaking, you have the tools. You have more tools than I had when I started. If you've ever been a GM or DM, if you've ever run that kind of project level sort of thing, you've got experience in talking to, if you've ever managed your family at a really bad family dinner and made sure the conversation did not go onto the topics you did not want your racist uncle to talk about, you have got experience.
Exactly. And it is okay to say to your convention, when if they ask you to moderate, or you checked off the box saying you were happy to moderate, it is okay to say, I have not moderated before. If there are any questions that you want me to ask, please pass those on. If there's anything you want me to stay away from, please let me know. Actually, those are probably good things to ask, even if you have moderated before.
Yeah.
So
and it's okay to say, I'm not comfortable moderating these really, really well-known writers, but I'm happy to moderate this fan panel about Star Trek. You know, you don't, just because you've ticked the yes box for moderation doesn't mean you have said yes to everything.
Exactly. Or you checked yes to this panel before you got your panelists, and now these are panelists, and you are very intimidated by your panelists, and you are not comfortable moderating these really big names. Although I would encourage you to, try to step out your comfort zone. They're lovely people most of the time.
95% of the time, they are absolutely fantastic people. And also, they've been on panels before, so they know how to, a lot of them will know how to be panelists. Even if you don't know how to be a moderator, they know how to be panelists.
Yeah. Like the YA panel where my vision suddenly went out was my very first time moderating in person. And I had a very experienced set of panelists. It was people who had been guests of honor before or were going to be guests of honor shortly. So I lucked out with that. And it would have been very easy for me to be like, oh, these are very big names. I'm not comfortable doing this because I'm coming at it as a fan of YA. But you have to start somewhere. It's okay to start here if you are okay starting there. It is also okay to say, I will do it, but I'm nervous. Like, you can let your panelists know you're nervous. They'll help you. If they're nice people, and most of them are, they'll help you.
And I will say, if you're from a different country than a lot of your panelists, like if they're Americans on your panel and you're very European and you aren't used to the way Americans can present themselves, once you get past the personality differences in terms of how they the cultural stuff, but it comes across as this person is arrogant, but actually that's their accent and that's how they present themselves as an author. But underneath that surface level, they're this really lovely person and they're really engaging to talk to, and they might seem like they're cool, calm, and collected at one point, and then suddenly they're a chaos gremlin, and you kind of just you just kind of need to get used to them, and it helps to talk to them in advance so that you know what to expect.
And even some of the best known people in the world suddenly sometimes go, I don't understand why you've put me on this panel.
Yeah. You're like, we literally built this panel around you.
Yes, now we have had that happen. Stories. Now we've had things that have happened writing programs.
So. Imposter syndrome goes everywhere.
We had that happen on our panel on imposter syndrome.
That's true, yes.
It is okay to fake it until you make it.
Oh yeah, I mean that is how I started moderating and how I sometimes continue to moderate.
But thank you very much for staying with us for this longer than intended panel. And we do hope that you feel more confident going and moderating in future. If you have any questions, feel free to ask
Leave
them
in
in
the
comments,
comments.
and
Yeah.
we'll respond where we can.
And if you
And
don't feel more confident, we're really sorry.
well, we hope that you do feel more
Yeah, we do
confident, or
hope
at least more reassured that, oh, if these people can moderate,
I think
I can do it.
that has probably been our best work for this evening, is demonstrating that yes, it's possible to do it, and also possible to moderate ourselves in some very weird way where we just kept shifting it around.
But
At some point, we all decided.
on topic.
At some point, we decided this wasn't going to be an hour anymore, so we just kept going. So.
I did, to be fair, I did actually message being like, we are definitely going over time. So, but thank you very much for joining us for this all good things in moderation, and just find your own style, find what works for you, and do it to the best of your ability. Bye.